In war, armies do not move on courage alone. They move on fuel, on ammunition, on food, on spare parts, on tires, oil, engines, and endless streams of supplies that have to arrive not tomorrow, but now. And in the fall of 1944, as Allied armies exploded across France after the breakout from Normandy, one terrifying truth emerged. The advance was moving so fast that victory itself was starting to outrun its own supply lines. At the front, General George Patton's forces were ready to keep hitting. German defenses were shaken. France was opening. The road into the heart of Nazi Europe was suddenly real. But there was a problem. The farther the Allies pushed, the longer the supply route became. Railways were wrecked, ports were strained, pipelines had not caught up. Frontline divisions were burning through mountains of gasoline and ammunition every single day. Tanks could not attack without fuel. Artillery could not fire without shells. Trucks could not move without replacement parts. An army that had just achieved one of the greatest breakthroughs of the war was in danger of slowing to a crawl for the simplest reason imaginable. It was starving. And so the United States responded the way it often did in World War II, not with panic, but with scale. What followed was one of the most extraordinary logistics operations in military history. It was called the Red Ball Express. Beginning on August 25, 1944, the Allies created a dedicated emergency supply network, unlike anything the Germans thought possible. This was not a normal transport system. It was a 24-hour, all-out logistical assault. A giant one-way loop of roads was carved through France for continuous truck traffic. Vehicles moved in one direction on one route and returned by another. No civilian traffic, no wasted time, no hesitation. Just trucks. Day and night, endlessly. At its peak, nearly 6,000 vehicles were operating in the system, driven by about 23,000 men, the overwhelming majority of them African-American soldiers serving in a segregated U.S. Army. Many had been assigned to support roles by a military establishment that denied them equality, limited their opportunities, and rarely gave them the recognition they deserved. But when the Allied advance threatened to stall, these men became indispensable. They were asked to do what many believed could not be done: drive overloaded trucks over shattered roads for hundreds of miles, drive in blackout conditions, drive in rain, mud, dust, and mechanical chaos, drive with little sleep, drive while engines overheated, tires blew, and convoys stretched far into the night. Drive while German forces, retreating but still dangerous, threatened roads and bridges. Drive until the men at the front had what they needed to keep killing the enemy. And they did. The Red Ball Express became the bloodstream of the Allied advance across France. Every day, an astonishing flow of fuel, rations, artillery shells, engineering supplies, and vehicle parts thundered eastward. More than 12,000 tons a day were delivered across routes that stretched over 400 miles. Over the course of the operation, more than 412,000 tons of supplies were moved over 122 million ton miles. That sounds like a statistic. For the Germans, it sounded like something else. It sounded like trucks, all night, every night. A nation that had built its war machine around speed and shock was now facing an enemy whose speed came not just from tanks, but from logistics on an industrial scale. German doctrine had long emphasized maneuver warfare, but Germany never truly solved the deeper problem beneath modern war: how to sustain rapid operations once front lines stretched and transport networks broke down. America did. And the Red Ball Express was proof. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to see the battlefield the way German commanders saw it in late 1944. Their armies in the West were under immense pressure. Air power punished movement. Fuel shortages were chronic. Ammunition had to be rationed. Replacements were dwindling. Retreating forces could not always regroup before the Allies were already on them again. And then came this monstrous reality. The Americans were not slowing down the way logic said they should. German officers had every reason to believe the Allied advance would eventually choke on distance. That was what happened in real war. That was what happened when armies outran railheads, when roads broke down, when trucks failed, when fuel consumption exploded. But the Americans kept coming, because behind the front was a system that simply refused to stop. The Red Ball Express was brutal work. Many of its drivers were barely trained for what they were being asked to do. Some had little experience driving heavy vehicles before the war. Now they were handling massive trucks under combat urgency, often overloaded far beyond peacetime limits. Speed mattered more than comfort. Delivery mattered more than preservation. If a truck could still move, it was used. If a driver could still sit upright, he kept driving. Mechanical failure was constant. On some days, around 30% of the vehicles suffered breakdowns or required repair. Tires shredded, engines died, axles cracked, headlights were restricted. Dust choked the roads by day, and darkness swallowed them at night. Military police tried to keep the system moving, but chaos was built into the mission. It was an emergency network designed to keep an army alive in motion. And somehow, it worked. Because American logistics in World War II was not just about trucks. It was about a civilization organized for output. When a vehicle failed, mechanics pulled parts, improvised repairs, cannibalized wrecks, and shoved it back into service. When roads jammed, routes were adjusted. When demand surged, more trucks were fed into the system. The Red Ball Express was not elegant. It was aggressive. It was the United States solving a battlefield crisis the same way its factories solved production crises, by pushing more men, more machines, and more material through the problem until the impossible became routine. And at the center of it were Black American drivers carrying a war machine that did not fully respect them. That is one of the most powerful truths in this story. These soldiers were helping power the liberation of Europe while serving inside a segregated army back home. They wore the uniform of a country, fighting Nazi racial ideology abroad, while still enforcing racial discrimination within its own ranks. Many received the hardest work, the least glory, and the fewest chances at public recognition. But the battlefield had a way of exposing what propaganda and prejudice tried to hide. Without them, the advance couldn't be sustained. Without them, Patton's armored spearheads would not have remained a spear at all. They would have become steel monuments, sitting still in French mud, waiting for fuel. And that is where the Red Ball Express became something bigger than a transport operation. It became a demonstration of what actually wins modern war. Not just bravery at the point of contact, not just famous generals, not just tanks breaking through hedgerows or infantry storming towns. Those things matter, but they only matter if the machine behind them keeps feeding the front. The Germans understood combat power. What they were now confronting was something even more dangerous, a nation whose battlefield strength rested on deep reserves of labor, industry, organization, and relentless logistical adaptation. To German soldiers on the ground, this was demoralizing in a very specific way. It was one thing to face an enemy division. It was another to realize that behind that division was a continuous mechanical civilization that could replace losses, replenish shells, refuel armor, and keep pressure on you without pause. You could blow up a tank, but how do you defeat a supply chain that never seems to end? You could delay a column, But what do you do when another convoy is already behind it? You could hear it at night. Engines, gear shifts, tires, movement, motion without rest. The sound of an army that would be back tomorrow because its lifeline was still running in the dark. That psychological impact mattered, because war is not only about destroying the enemy's capacity, it is about crushing his belief that he can endure. And the Red Ball Express sent a message that was impossible to ignore. America was not fighting as a single army. America was fighting as an industrial civilization. By the time the operation ended on November 16th, 1944, it had run for 82 grueling days. In that time, it delivered a scale of support that helped keep Allied momentum alive during one of the most critical phases of the Western campaign. It helped bridge the dangerous gap between breakout and stabilization. It brought speed when speed was everything. And by sustaining the offensive pressure, it helped ensure that German forces had less time to recover, reorganize, and rebuild coherent resistance. That is why the Red Ball Express matters so much, because it reveals the hidden side of victory. Not the charge, but the engine behind the charge. Not the headline battle, but the ceaseless motion that made battles possible. Not the mythology of war, but the reality of it. Men with grease on their hands, drivers half awake at the wheel, convoys moving under blackout rules, mechanics reviving dying trucks, officers begging for fuel, dispatchers forcing order onto chaos, a giant artery of steel and gasoline pumping life into an army racing across Europe. And in that reality, the Red Ball Express did more than move supplies. It shattered assumptions. German planners had built campaigns around the belief that every army had limits that could be reached, and once those limits were reached, movement would collapse into hesitation. But the Red Ball Express showed that the American way of war, at its most powerful, could delay that collapse far beyond what the enemy thought possible. That mattered in France in 1944, and it still matters in how we understand victory today. Because when people remember World War II, they often remember the dramatic moments at the front, the beaches, the tanks, the dogfights, the flags. But behind every one of those images was a less glamorous truth. Someone had to keep the army moving. Someone had to carry the fuel. Someone had to bring the shells. Someone had to drive through the night so that daylight belonged to the men at the front. And in the late summer and fall of 1944, that someone was the Red Ball Express. Thousands of drivers, most of them African American, carrying the weight of an entire campaign across broken French roads, proving under impossible conditions that logistics is not the background of war. It is war. Because in the end, Nazi Germany was not only beaten by Allied courage, it was beaten by Allied endurance, by American output, by organizational flexibility, by the ability to turn roads into arteries, trucks into lifelines, and industrial strength into battlefield momentum. The Red Ball Express was not glamorous. It was louder than glory, dirtier than glory, more exhausting than glory. And yet, without it, much of the glory that followed might never have happened. That is the legacy of the Red Ball Express, an operation born from crisis, driven by men denied the credit they had earned, and remembered today as one of the clearest examples of a brutal wartime truth. The army that keeps moving is the army that wins.